ត្រីដូចខ្មោចស្អីគេអត់ខ្លាចតែឥឡូវខ្លាចមនុស្សទៀតខ្លាច
Hello, welcome to another episode of On the Detail. My name is Chad Samuth, your host, and today we are joined by the very lovely, talented, and very accomplished Kalyanee Mam. Kalyanee Mam just recently received an award at the Sundance Film Festival in Salt Lake City, Utah, for the Grand Jury Award of World Documentary Films. Okay, but before that, we want to give the audience an idea of Kalyanee's phenomenal background, which I find is very interesting. A little bit, Kalyanee was born in Battambang, right? Why don't you tell me kind of where we are now from that point when you were born in Battambang?
Well, I just want to say, Chad, thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm just thrilled to be here and also to celebrate all the wonderful films that are going to be here this weekend at the Cambodia Town, the first Cambodia Town Film Festival. I'm so proud of everyone who's put this all together. Really proud of you guys. So yeah, well, my background, I was born in Cambodia, in Battambang, in 1977 during the Khmer Rouge regime. And my family fled the country in '79, when the Khmer Rouge fell from power. And then we went to Gawidang, to the refugee camp there, and we lived there for about maybe a year or two before we eventually immigrated to the United States in 1981. First to Houston, Texas, and then to Stockton. But yeah, I grew up with my parents and my family telling me so many stories about my culture and my history and my past. I was too young to remember what the Khmer Rouge was like, but for my parents it was really important for them that I grew up knowing what my culture, about my culture and about my tradition and about my past. And so they always, told us stories about the Khmer Rouge period, even the atrocities that happened during that time, even the most horrific stories they told us because they didn't want us to forget. And one of the things that my parents did for us that I, to this day, I cannot thank them enough, is that they forced us to speak Khmer at home. So every day I spoke Khmer to my mother and my father and, to our siblings, but, at school I spoke English. And I would never have been able to do the things that I do if I didn't speak Khmer. And I'm so thankful to them and so grateful, that they really instilled that in us. Not just the language, but also the culture and the tradition. So I grew up with this love for my country. And, but it wasn't until 1998, during the summer of my junior year of college at Yale, that I was able to return to my home country. And that was 17 years, after my family and I fled the country. And I can't, even begin to describe the feeling, the overwhelming feeling that I felt. The first time, I flew that plane and, I could see from the window, all the palm trees, that lined the countryside. And we flew over Phnom Penh, and Phnom Penh at that time was very different from what it is now. I mean, there were no buildings, no tall buildings or skyscrapers. It was just a lot of palm trees in the countryside. And the light was reflecting on the water, glinting on the water, that, off of the rice fields. Right. And that was my first image of Cambodia. And my heart dropped. I felt like I was coming home again, even though I had no memory or recollection of what home was before. But that summer of 1998 was the summer that I fell in love with Cambodia. Fell in love with the country and the people. And I traveled all over the country. I was working on my senior thesis on the endurance of the Cambodian family under the Khmer Rouge regime. And I traveled all over the country and interviewed families about their experiences during the Khmer Rouge. And that's when I fell in love with the Cambodian people. And so that's something that's always been with me, right. And still with me now, right. Obviously. That's genocide program, right. Yeah, while I was there, right. Yeah.
And then shortly after that, later on down your academic career, UCLA Law School,
yes.
Immigration Law?
Yeah.
Okay.
Immigration and Refugee Law.
Okay. And so how did you make the transition from,
I know,
law
it's crazy.
into filmmaking? I just want to
Yeah, I don't know how that happened. I don't even have a clear answer because there was no clear, I had no vision that I wanted to be a filmmaker. Never in my life did I think, oh yeah, you're going to be a filmmaker one day. Right. It wasn't in my mind at all. But after law school, I worked in Mozambique for a consulting firm, a legal consulting firm in Mozambique for 2 years, and then I went to Iraq, and I worked in Iraq for 6 months. And I was supposed to stay there for a year, but I couldn't handle it. It was just so tough to be there for 6 months even.
Wow.
But I eventually left Iraq, and you know, I felt so, you know, it's like, I felt like I was leaving my friends behind. You know, all the Iraqi friends that I had made there, you know, I was leaving them behind. And just because I had a US passport. You know, it's like you were able to flee the Khmer Rouge, you know.
I was going to ask you, there's like a similar
Exactly,
like,
it's a
line
very
in-
similar
yeah.
line. And, you know, there were 2 million Iraqi refugees fleeing Iraq at that time to neighboring countries like Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And I wanted to inform the world of what was happening to them. And I felt that the only way that I could do it was not through legal means. You know, I mean, I could use my legal skills to help them become refugees, but I felt that if I wanted to help more people, I had to do it with film. I had to find a way to inform more people, millions of people at the same time, about what was happening in Iraq, and that's when I decided to become a filmmaker. And I still don't think I'm a filmmaker, really. I mean, you know, it's just, I think for me, it's just a tool, you know, a tool to express myself, a tool to inform people, a tool to advocate, a tool, you know, of creativity. And at that time, I just felt that, you know, this is, you know, something I needed to do. And I had no skills. I didn't know how to, I never held a camera in my life. You know, I never, you know, except to take pictures, but I didn't have any video making skills at all. But I had the passion. You know, like there's something so deep in my heart that I felt like I needed to express myself this way. And no matter what the challenges were, it didn't matter. Because all that mattered was that I needed to get that message out.
You're driven by that internal
Exactly, exactly. And I think that for a lot of, I mean, I think of some, you know, Cambodian youth, young Cambodian people are, you know, listening to this interview, hopefully. You know, and they're probably wondering to themselves, you know, how can I do it? You know, how can I, you know, follow my passion? I think really you just need to do it. Don't be afraid. I mean, it's the fear that really cuts us. You know, it's the fear that prevents us from moving forward. You know, if we tear down those walls, tear down that fear, then anything is possible.
So you've essentially dismissed all formalities, all the prerequisites, all the linear process of going through, about doing this.
Well, you
and
know,
just
life
following-
isn't linear.
Correct, yeah.
You know, life isn't linear at all.
Right.
And I think the Cambodian and American community knows that more than anyone else, that life isn't linear. I mean, look at all of us. Most of us are immigrants. Most of us are refugees. You know, we left our country, we're forced to leave our country and resettle in a new country, learn a new language, adapt to a new culture. That is not linear. You know, that is a completely, you know, upheaval. And I think we need to accept that chaos in our lives, you know, and learn to embrace it and then use it to inspire us, you know, to do something meaningful.
That's beautiful. Going further along with your film career, you did a documentary called The Inside Job.
Yeah, Inside Job, yeah.
And The Inside Job, to my understanding, was kind of all the events kind of leading up to the economic crisis that happened in 2008. So that kind of gave you more experience and more kind of hands-on with the tools that were able to create film. And then 2 years after that, 2013, you produced what is now A River Changes Course. Tell us a little more about that process. How, like, what you said, 6 months? No, 3 years. That you spent in Cambodia.
Not 6 months.
Yeah,
like.
that's a different one. But A River Changes Course is 3 years. Walk us through that experience. What was that like? Some of the challenges, you know, that you had to face to make that happen.
You know, first I'll just. So I was. You know, as I told you, it was the first time I went to Cambodia was in 1998. After that time, I continued to travel to Cambodia and working with the Documentation Center of Cambodia, you know, doing research. I wrote another paper on crimes committed against women during the Khmer Rouge regime, which is being used for the trial of the Khmer Rouge leaders at the moment. During the times that I visited Cambodia and worked in Cambodia, throughout the years, I noticed that the country was changing dramatically. But it wasn't until 2008, you know, when I went to, you know, Cambodia, that I realized that the country was not the country that I knew, you know, in 1998. You know, it was so different from the 10 years before that I was there. All the forests, you know, in 1998 I went to Ratanakari, for example, which is in the northeastern part of Cambodia. And I went there to visit the place, the area, and it was filled with forests. The northeastern part of Cambodia is famous for its jungles and its forests, and also for its indigenous population. And when I went to Cambodia in 2008, all that forest, much of that forest had been cut down.
Oh, wow.
And so all the land, that we saw before, before we had to fly a plane to get there, and at that time you can just easily, drive, to that area. And all the forests were cut down, and in its place were planted, rubber plantations, cassava plantations, sugar plantations. And all the timber that was being cut down was being shipped abroad, not for local consumption. And I also noticed that the Lay Sap, lake that we are famous for, which is one of the largest, most diverse bodies of freshwater in the world, was also being fished to extinction. And I also noticed that a lot of women, that the city in Phnom Penh was just filled with factories, and all the women were coming from the villages, migrating from the villages and coming to work in the factories in Phnom Penh. And I wondered, what was happening. Of course, development is good. We want to move forward as a country, and Cambodia should move forward and should progress. But in that process, I wondered, what kind of consequences was taking place, what kind of impact, development was having on people's lives and on the environment. And it was that moment that I realized that I needed to do something. I needed to document, what was happening. I don't know if you're familiar and if many people who are listening to this are familiar, but thousands of families in Cambodia have been displaced as a result of, their land being taken from them, or them being evicted from their homes, or their farmland being bulldozed over. So people are losing their livelihood. People are losing their land. When you think of Cambodia, you think of rice. Think of rice fields, and when you think of Cambodian culture, you think of rice. You can't eat food without rice, and you also can't eat food without fish. Right. But all of this is disappearing in Cambodia, and people are losing access to their livelihood. And so I wanted to make a documentary that would expose what is happening, and make people more aware, of what's going on.
And the way you went about that, you said 3 years you were out there, and you stayed with 3 families?
Yes.
3 characters. Tell us a little about these 3 individuals.
So the families that I decided I wanted to, to follow, they're just really,
all, how did you find them?
I know. Yeah, it's the first family was Sadi's family, and they live in a floating village on the Lay Sap Lake and the Lay Sap River in Kampong Chnang. And Sadi's family is Jam Muslim. There are actually 200,000 Jam Muslim people who live in Cambodia, but not many people are aware of that. He belongs to a distinct, ethnic minority in Cambodia. And his family and many Jam families, and actually many Cambodian families as well, depend on fishing, for their livelihood. When I met Sadi, that was in 2008, he was a young boy. He was like 14 years old. And when I met him, he drove me in a boat out into the middle of the river and the middle of the lake, and he told me stories about his family and their struggles, their struggles to adapt to this changing environment. And I knew at that moment that I wanted to follow him. I wanted to tell his story. Right. And Sadi's, Sav Samorn, the other family that we followed, was in Ratanakari. And they live in Ratanakari now, in the jungles in Ratanakari. And as I told you before, that area was filled with jungles before, and now it's all being cut down. And Sav Samorn is one of the lucky ones who is still living, one of the lucky indigenous groups. She and her family and her village are one of the lucky ones who are still living in the forests. Many of them have already been displaced. Many of them have already been thrown off their land and their forest and their jungle. And with indigenous people, the forest is their life.
Yeah, it's a livelihood.
Yeah, you depend on the forest for food. You depend on the forest, for wild animals. You depend on the forest for everything. And so, I don't know. I think in a few years' time, I think that Sav Samorn and her family may not be there anymore. And that is the fate of many indigenous groups, living in Cambodia right now. And then the last story is Kyo Mok, and she's just a wonderful girl, and she was forced to leave her village to come work in the garment factories in Phnom Penh, and the reason was because her family was struggling from debt. You know, they had to borrow money in order to buy land, in order to have enough food to eat, you know, to buy land, to grow rice and have enough food to eat. And so she came to work in the garment factories in Phnom Penh. And she is one of, you know, 300,000 other women who have left their village to come work in the garment factories in Cambodia.
And it just becomes like this vicious cycle of just barely surviving.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. You know, and I met with Kyo recently. I was in Cambodia at the end of July for Cambodia's 5th national elections, which just took place.
Right.
And I went back to document the elections, but really to follow her back to her village as she cast her vote. And you know, when I met with Kyo, I asked her, you know, what her hope was for the future and what she wanted for her and her family. And she told me the only thing she wants is a livable wage. You know,
how old is she again?
She is almost 30 now. I think she's 29. I think she's turning 30 this year.
And was this her first time voting?
Yeah. No. This is her 5th time voting.
Okay.
She's voted every single election.
Okay.
And you know, just they're all struggling to survive. I mean, at first when I filmed her, she was making $61 a month. Just this past few months, her wages were raised to $80 a month. But that's not enough. That's not enough to survive in Cambodia. I don't know if you've visited Cambodia, you know Cambodia well, but it's expensive in Cambodia.
Yeah.
It's not that cheap.
Right.
And people cannot afford to live there anymore. She's barely struggling to survive. And her wages are not just to support herself. It's to support her family too, you know, to send back to her family, to send back home. You know, and that was the most important thing to her for the elections. That was the most important thing, was to be able to make enough to make ends meet. You know, when people are struggling just to make ends meet, that means there's a problem. You know, that means that we are really at an uncertain time, that something needs to happen, something needs to change. And you know, when she said that, you know, when I talked to her and I interviewed her, it made me think about the United States. You know, it made me think about Cambodian Americans here in the United States. You know, we are also struggling to make ends meet. All of us are. Unless you're making $100,000 a year, you're really struggling. I mean, the price of food is growing exponentially. You know, the price of fuel, just to get around, just to fill up your tank, your gas tank, it's just ridiculous. And the cost of healthcare, the cost of education. You know, I have loans. I have like over $100,000 in student loans from law school that I'm still paying off. You know, that shouldn't be the case. Everyone should be able to afford to go to school. And people are struggling to go to school right now. And so the struggles that are happening in Cambodia is happening here in the United States. It's happening in Colombia. It's happening in China. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in South America. It's happening all over the world. People are struggling the same thing. You know, we all think we're like living in isolation, but we're not. We're all part of a global community. And that global community is fueled by a global financial system that places profit over human dignity and individual lives. You know, and families, when families have to struggle to make ends meet, we have a problem. You know, and I think here in Long Beach, you know, I'm sure that, you know, especially after the financial crisis, you know, it's been a struggle for everyone. Yeah.
Well, Kalyanee, thank you so much for spending some time with us here on the Kadale, and thank you for all the information you've shared with us. I hope that our audience have found that to be informative, inspiring, and hope that this will invoke some action, you know, on the community part. So on that note, thank you so much, Samakud.
Yeah,
and for the audience, thank you so much for tuning in to this segment of On Kadale, and we'll see you soon. Samakud.